The most juicy and tender, amazing smoked beef short ribs you've ever seen, piled atop the cheesiest, creamiest smoked mac and cheese, topped with barbecue sauce and green onion, all coming together to make what is perhaps the most rich and indulgent thing I've ever cooked on a smoker. Now, I've been wanting to do a video for a while in which I make my, quote, famous macaroni and cheese. But being that it's summer and I'm all into smoking and barbecuing this time of year, I wanted to think of a way to incorporate that into my macaroni and cheese video. I thought maybe pulled pork, but I just did a pork shoulder on the smoker. Chicken, maybe. Pork belly could be good. And then it hit me, of course, the most succulent and juicy beef short rib, slow smoked, shredded apart, and put on top of a big pile of the mac and cheese. So in this video, we're going to go through every step of making not only the macaroni and cheese, but also the smoked beef short rib. There's a handful of steps, and I've got many hours of smoking ahead of me, but luckily for you, it's going to get condensed down incredibly quick into a relatively short video, as I guess is always the case. So anyway, enough of the intro. Let's get right into it and take a look at the amazing rack of beef short ribs we're going to be working with today. I've got a long cook ahead of me, so right away I'm going to get my smoker fired up. So I'll light some hardwood lump charcoal and get that into my firebox, along with a couple oak splits. Now to let the Oklahoma Joe offset come up to temperature. And in the meantime, I'll get the meat ready. This here is a rack of beef short ribs and currently holds the record for the most money I've ever spent on a single piece of meat. I didn't really need 4 entire short ribs, but I figured if I'm going to go all out to smoke these things, I ought to make it worthwhile. Anyway, there's not a ton that I'm going to be doing to these ribs to get them ready. There's a couple odd bits of dangly fat that I'll trim off, but that's about it. I'm not shaving down the fat cap. I'm not removing any membranes. These ribs will be cooking for a very long time and becoming insanely tender. And I want it all to stay pretty intact on the smoker, and all of that is just going to help hold the whole thing together. And since my intention is to ultimately shred the meat up to put on top of mac and cheese, I can quickly and easily pull out any bits of membrane or extra big pieces of fat when the time comes. But of course I'll be seasoning the ribs, and seasoning quite heavily. I'm basically going for maximum bark on this thing. I usually don't bother with a binder like mustard because the meat tends to be moist enough for the seasoning to stick just fine. And today I'm going with a very basic SPG rub because I don't want to drown out the succulent short rib flavor with too many overpowering spices. And if you're curious, my ratio for this particular SPG mix is 3 parts coarse black pepper, 2 parts kosher salt, 1 part granulated garlic. Once I've got this baby nicely covered in the rub, it's time to get it on the smoker, bone side down and on the opposite side from the firebox. As always, I'll go ahead and stick one of my digital thermometer probes in there, and I'll do my best to maintain the smoker temperature at between 225 and 250 degrees Fahrenheit over the next 8 or so hours, until the internal temperature of the ribs is about 205 degrees. And after the first 2 or so hours of cooking, I'll start spritzing the ribs with beef broth about every 30 minutes. Well, we're at about the 6-hour mark of the smoke, and I figure it's a good time to start getting the mac and cheese component of this dish ready. And since the whole pan of mac and cheese is going to be going into the smoker at the end to bake a little bit anyway, it's perfectly fine that I'm making it a little bit in advance. That is, a little bit before I'm actually going to need it. In fact, I could have made the whole mac and cheese part yesterday, wrapped it up, threw it in the fridge, and then today just stick the whole pan in the smoker anyway, though it would certainly take a little extra time to heat back up if it was in the fridge all night. Anyway, it's mac and cheese time. For my quote famous ultra cheesy mac and cheese, I'll be using 8 ounces of medium cheddar cheese, 8 ounces of sharp cheddar cheese, and 8 ounces of Gruyere cheese. And I have to get this all shredded up, but because I really do not feel like hand grating 3/4 of a pound of cheese right now, I'll be using the grater attachment on my food processor, which makes extremely fast work of this task. And I'll mix all the cheese together in a big bowl and set it aside in the fridge until I'm ready for it. By the way, you could use pre-shredded cheese from the store, but they mix anti-caking agents in with it, and it always comes out better when you grate it yourself from a solid block. Next, a little prep work. My mac and cheese is the best because I don't skimp on flavor. So I'm going to finely chop a small yellow onion, and then I'll seed and finely chop one jalapeno. And before I start building the sauce for the mac, I'll get a pot of salted water heating up on the stove since it'll take a few minutes to come to a boil. Okay, the sauce. I'll start by melting an entire stick of butter in my big Enamel Dutch oven. Again, people want to eat my mac and cheese because it tastes the best, not because it's diet food. Once the butter is melted, in goes the chopped onion and jalapeno. I'll let that cook for a couple minutes until nicely softened. And now for the roux. I'll add a half cup of all-purpose flour and whisk everything together until I've got a nice buttery paste. Let that cook for a solid minute so it doesn't have a raw flour taste. And now I'll start adding my liquids. First, half and half. I'll gradually pour in 2.5 cups of half and half, whisking pretty much constantly. And then I'll do the exact same thing with 1.5 cups of whole milk. Pour, whisk, pour, whisk. Once all the liquid is in, I'll let this all come back up to a simmer over medium heat, whisking pretty regularly. And now is the perfect time to drop in my pasta noodles. To make my mac and cheese extra fancy, I like to use these cavatappi noodles, which I guess are also sometimes called celentani. They're a little bigger and they just class the dish up a bit, but you can certainly use regular elbow macaroni if you prefer. I'll let that boil for a few minutes until it's just shy of al dente. I want them to be slightly undercooked since they will be essentially cooked again in the cheese sauce. And just about the time my sauce starts bubbling, the mixture is at just about the thickness I'm looking for, which means it's time to start adding the cheese. I'll be using 3 cups of the shredded cheese at this stage, and I'll stir it into the sauce about 1 cup at a time to make sure nothing gets clumpy or lumpy. Once all 3 cups are stirred in and beautifully melted, I'll add my seasonings: kosher salt, black pepper, garlic powder, and paprika. And don't worry about quantities. I'll have a link to the full recipe in the video description below. Finally, it's time to drain the pasta and add it into the sauce. I'll fold and stir all of it in until entirely incorporated and looking absolutely delicious. This right here might be the best mac and cheese you ever tasted, but there are still a few steps of deliciousness yet to come. I'm going to transfer about half of the noodle mix into a casserole dish, or in my case, since I'll be putting the whole thing into a smoker, a disposable baking pan. I usually make this recipe for the oven, in which case a deep casserole dish is perfect. Anyway, now I'm going to sprinkle half of my remaining cheese over top. Remember, I didn't mix all of that shredded cheese into the sauce. Now the rest of the noodle mix goes in, followed by the rest of the cheese. Now this 12,000 calorie pan of happiness is ready to bake, but the ribs aren't quite ready to come out of the smoker yet, so I'll cover the pan with some aluminum foil and set aside until it's time. And here we are at the end of the cook for those ribs. The internal temp is just about 205 degrees, and that meat is probing as tender as I could possibly imagine. So I'm pulling these things out of the smoker and bringing them inside. But unfortunately for everyone with taste buds, the ribs need to rest for basically an entire hour before even thinking about digging into them. So I'll wrap them with 2 layers of heavy aluminum foil and set them aside. But that resting period gives us the perfect amount of time to finish the mac and cheese. So I'm cranking up the heat in my smoker to about 350 degrees Fahrenheit, and then in goes that whole pan, uncovered, for about 30 minutes. If I had the mac and cheese in the fridge all night, I'd surely have to go longer, but really I'm just trying to get all the extra cheese nice and melty and bring the whole thing up to a nice eating temperature. Okay, resting is finished and it's finally time to slice these short ribs. Tender and juicy doesn't even begin to describe what I'm dealing with here. Just look at that huge slab of rib meat. At this moment, it almost feels like a sin to pull this thing apart to throw on some mac and cheese, but this is the task at hand, so shred I must. But I think I've earned a quick taste. Oh, the bark. Oh my God. All right, what were we doing again? Oh yeah. Okay, back to shredding. While I absolutely do not need the fork to shred this meat apart, it's still pretty frickin' hot, so I'm using the fork anyway. And I'll go ahead and pull out the couple especially large hunks of gelatinous fat that haven't completely rendered, and the little bit of membrane in there. And with this glistening pile of meat ready to go, I can, at long last, assemble my final product that has been 9 hours in the making. I'll start by loading up an unnecessarily large bowl with a colossal serving of the mac and cheese that's just come out of the smoker. And while I usually like to broil my mac and cheese for a couple minutes when baking in the oven to get a beautiful brown bubbly layer of cheese on top, I can't exactly achieve that in the smoker. So instead, I'll sprinkle just a little more shredded cheese over top and hit it with my blowtorch, just to take the presentation here needlessly over the top. I mean, come on. This makes Kraft boxed mac and cheese look like penitentiary grade dog food. And atop that sea of cheesy goodness goes a mountain of insanely tender, impossibly juicy, barky, savory short rib. And since this whole thing is basically the ultimate culmination of barbecue comfort food, a drizzle of my homemade barbecue sauce couldn't hurt anything. And what's that? A sprinkle of chopped green onion? Well, if you insist. And there we have it. If this right here isn't a bowl of food you'd trip your loved ones to get at, I don't know what is. I'm a man who likes to think of himself as somebody with a rather extensive vocabulary, but I don't even know what the right word is to describe that bite of food I just had. I think the word delicious has already shown up way too many times in this video, and that just doesn't quite feel good enough. I think this might have to be one of those like once a year meals because of just how bad it must be for me and the fact that so much work goes into making it. Probably more so the first thing. And, even if you don't want to smoke a rack of short ribs for 8 hours, you could make them in the oven, or you could do braised short ribs, or you don't have to do the ribs at all. If you take away only one thing from this video, I guess let it be my macaroni and cheese recipe. You can even make the whole tray of the stuff, refrigerate it for later in the week, freeze it for later in the month or year. I promise anyone in your house who likes mac and cheese is gonna never ask for a different version of it if they've tried this one. So I guess there's not much more to say. This is just an absolutely insanely delicious way to eat macaroni and cheese. And if you've got some money burning a hole in your pocket and you've got about 9 or 10 hours to blow on a Saturday or something, well, this might be one that you want to try out. And as always, I'll have a link to the full recipe in the video description below that includes everything that I made here today. And be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future smoking and barbecue videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.